Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're diving into something that really gets right to the heart of who we think we are. We're looking at the very first chapter of a source titled, You Are Not Your Mind.
That's right. And this book, it really just drops us straight into a pretty core idea. M-
Right, I remember that one.
Then a stranger comes along, points to the box he's sitting on, and says, "Have you ever looked inside?" Turns out the box is full of gold.
Wow.
The beggar was sitting on his treasure the whole time, but was too busy looking outside himself for scraps.
And the author, they're basically positioning themselves as that stranger, telling you, the reader, to look inside. Not in a physical box, obviously, but somewhere even closer within yourself.
hmm
Hmm?
The argument is, if you haven't found your true wealth, which the source describes as this, like radiant joy and unshakable peace, then you're essentially living like that beggar.
Even with material wealth.
Exactly. Even if you have everything else materially,
Yeah.
you're constantly seeking fulfillment, security, love, whatever it is, outside yourself, completely missing this infinite treasure they claim is right there inside.
Which immediately challenges how we typically think about something like enlightenment, right? The book really pushes back hard against the idea that it's some kind of, superhuman achievement or destiny, only for a select few.
Totally. Instead, it's framed as your natural state, a felt oneness with what the source calls being. It's this deep connectedness with something immense, indestructible, something that is essentially you, but also much, much vaster than your individual self.
And the inability to feel that connection.
That's the key. That inability creates the illusion of separation.
Mm.
And the source links that directly to fear, conflict, all the big problems we see.
The author even brings in the Buddha, highlighting his simple definition. Enlightenment is the end of suffering.
Yeah, and they point out that, while maybe that's not the complete picture, it's a brilliant definition because it stops the mind from turning enlightenment into like some complex belief system or an impossible goal way off in the future.
Makes it immediate.
Right? Personal and immediate. But as the source also notes, even with that simple definition, most people still tend to think of it as, well, that's for someone else or maybe someday, but definitely not for me. Not right now.
Okay, so let's unpack this word being that comes up right away. What exactly does the source mean by that?
Well, they describe being as the eternal, ever-present one life. It's the indestructible essence, deep within every single form, not just us, but like trees, animals, everything.
And crucially, it's accessible now.
Right now, it's not some distant concept. It's your deepest self, your true nature, available in this moment.
But here's the tricky part. The source points out you can't grasp being with your thinking mind. You can't just sort of figure it out intellectually.
That's a really crucial point. They say you can only know being when the mind is still, when you're fully present in the now. That state of actually feeling that realization of being, that is what the source calls enlightenment.
Right, and the author anticipates the obvious question, is being just another word for God?
Yeah, they tackle that directly. The author says they use the word God pretty sparingly. They feel it's become kind of empty, maybe, misused over centuries, and it often creates a mental image of something separate from us, something out there.
Like a concept we believe in rather than experience.
Exactly. The core distinction for them is whether a word points beyond itself to that transcendental reality, or if it just becomes another mental idol, another concept.
So why being?
Being is preferred because it's presented as an open concept. You can't really form a mental image of being, can you? And it's immediately accessible as the feeling of your own presence, that fundamental I am realization that exists before you add anything to it, like I am a teacher or I am tired.
Just the pure sense of existing.
Precisely, the I am itself.
Okay. So if this being is our true nature and it's accessible right now, what on earth is stopping us? What's getting in the way?
The source is incredibly direct here. The single greatest obstacle, they state flat out, is our identification with our mind,
Identification with the mind.
which leads to thinking becoming this compulsive, incessant activity.
And they don't mince words, do they? They call it a dreadful affliction.
Yeah, a dreadful affliction. But what's fascinating is they say it's considered normal just because almost everyone suffers from it. This constant mental noise, this nonstop stream of thoughts, it completely blocks us from accessing that inner stillness where we can connect with being.
And it creates this false mind-made self.
Exactly, this identity built purely on thoughts, memories, labels,
Mm,
which then casts this shadow of fear and suffering over everything. The author even contrasts it with Descartes, I think, therefore I am.
right.
They argue that equating thinking with who you fundamentally are, with being, is the most basic error we make.
So this compulsive thinker, which the source suggests is pretty much all of
Most
us,
of us, yeah.
is living in this state of seeming separation, constant conflict, complexity.
Right.
It's just a reflection of the mind's own fragmentation.
Whereas enlightenment, in this view, is wholeness. It's being at one with life, at one with your deepest self. It's the end of suffering, precisely because it's the end of this like enslavement to nonstop thinking.
The book uses this idea of an opaque screen created by the mind.
Yeah, a screen made up of all our concepts, labels, judgments, stories, everything the mind projects onto reality. And this screen, it blocks true relationship, not just with other people or nature, but even with ourselves, with being.
It creates the illusion of separation. Me here, you over there.
Totally separate. You forget, or rather, you stop feeling the essential fact that underneath all the surface appearances, you're fundamentally connected, one with everything. You might believe it intellectually.
But you don't feel it.
Right. And the source stresses that a belief might be comforting, but only the actual experience is liberating.
There's that analogy they use too, comparing it to disease.
Oh yeah, that's powerful. Just like unchecked cell division is disease in the body, thinking becomes a kind of disease when it's out of balance, when it completely dominates the whole system.
But the mind is a tool, right? A superb instrument, they
Yeah.
say.
It absolutely is, when used rightly. But wrongly used, or rather,
Hmm.
the author corrects themselves, actually. They say it's usually not that you use your mind wrongly, it's that most of the time you don't use it at all.
It uses you.
It uses you. And that is the disease, the delusion. You actually believe you are this mind, this instrument that has taken you over.
Okay, but what about the argument, well, I can use my mind, I solve problems, I design things.
They anticipate that.
Hmm.
And the response is quite provocative. Just because you can solve a crossword or, figure out complex equations doesn't mean you are consciously using your mind. The mind loves problems. It thrives on them.
So what's the real test?
The real test they propose is, can you be free of your mind whenever you want? Have you found the off button? Can you just choose to stop the inner commentary?
And if you can't?
Then, the source says pretty bluntly, the mind is using you. You're unconsciously identified with it. You're its slave. It's almost like being possessed, but you mistake the possessing entity for your actual self.
Which leads to the first step towards freedom.
Exactly. The beginning of freedom, they claim, is this simple but incredibly profound realization. You are not the thinker. You are not that voice in your head.
Okay, that's a huge realization. You are not the thinker. But practically speaking, how do you even begin to get there? The source introduces this key practice, watching the thinker.
And they point out something most of us probably notice if we pay attention.
Yeah.
Everyone has this voice, or maybe multiple voices, going on in their head pretty much constantly.
Hmm.
It's this stream of involuntary thought, right?
Yeah.
Like an incessant internal monologue or dialogue.
Yeah, the commentary track.
Exactly. The voice that comments on everything, judges, compares, complains, replays past events, rehearses future scenarios,
Yeah.
often imagining the worst outcomes, which is basically worry.
And it's conditioned, right, by our past, our culture.
Completely. It filters everything. It distorts your view of the present moment because it's always looking through the lens of the past. The author doesn't hold back. They call this voice a person's own worst enemy sometimes, a tormentor causing so much misery.
But the good news, according to the source, is that you can free yourself. This is the real liberation.
And the first step sounds deceptively simple. Just start listening to that voice in your head as often as you can. Pay attention to what it's saying. Notice the repetitive thought patterns, the loops,
This is watching the thinker.
or listening to the voice. But the crucial part is how you listen. You listen as the witnessing presence.
And impartiality is key here. No judging.
Absolutely critical.
Hmm.
Do not judge or condemn what you hear. Because, as the source points out, that judgment, that's just the same voice sneaking back in through the back door.
Right. So as you listen from this witnessing perspective, a new awareness starts to emerge.
That's the idea. You start to realize, okay, there is the voice,
Mm-hmm.
and here I am listening to it, watching it. This I am realization, this sense of your own presence, it's not another thought. It arises from somewhere deeper beyond the mind.
How does that work? How does listening make the thought lose power?
Well, when you truly listen to a thought, you become aware of two things: the thought itself, and yourself as the witness observing it. A new dimension of consciousness kind of activates. You feel this,
Mm.
this conscious presence, your deeper self, quietly there behind the thought.
And that disconnects you from it.
Exactly. The thought loses its power because you're no longer fueling it with your identification.
Yeah.
You're no longer believing I am that thought. It tends to subside much more quickly. And this, they say, is the beginning of the end of compulsive involuntary thinking.
And when that stream of thought subsides, even briefly, there's that discontinuity the source talks about, a gap.
Yes, a gap of no mind. Initially, these gaps might just be a few seconds long. But the more you practice this watching, the longer they become.
And what happens in those gaps?
Something else emerges. A sense of inner stillness and peace.
Which,
The beginning of experiencing your natural state, that oneness with being, which is usually totally obscured by all the mental noise. As you practice, that stillness deepens. It feels like it has no end. And the source adds, you might also start to feel this subtle joy rising up from deep within the joy of being.
and it's important to clarify this isn't like zoning out or being in a trance.
No, quite the opposite. The source is very clear on this. There's no loss of consciousness. If anything, you become more alert, more awake, more fully present. They even suggest it literally raises the vibrational frequency of your energy field.
Going deeper into this realm of no mind, as they call it.
Yeah, it's a term used in the East. The source says you can realize a state of pure consciousness.
Pure consciousness, what's that like?
They describe it as feeling your own presence with such intensity and joy that everything else, thoughts, emotions, your body, the external world, becomes relatively insignificant in comparison.
Sounds a bit detached.
But they clarify, it's not selfish, it's actually selfless. It takes you beyond your old, limited idea of self. This presence, they explain, is both essentially you and, paradoxically, inconceivably greater than you. It's one of those things the author admits is hard to put into words.
Okay, so watching the thinker is one main practice, but the source offers another way to create those gaps in the mind stream, right? Focusing on the now.
Yes, exactly. Directing your attention intensely into the present moment. Just becoming radically conscious of this moment, right here, right now. They describe it as a deeply satisfying thing to do.
And how does that create the gap?
It simply draws consciousness away from mind activity, away from the past, away from the future, away from the constant analysis and commentary. And that creates the space, the gap of no mind, where you are fully alert and aware, but not actually thinking.
And the source says that is the essence of meditation.
That's it. Whatever the technique, the core is withdrawing attention from thought and bringing it into the present.
And you can practice this anywhere, anytime.
They really encourage bringing this into everyday life. Take any routine activity you normally do on autopilot, walking upstairs, washing your hands, getting into the car, closing the door.
Things you don't even think about.
Exactly. And give that simple action your fullest attention. Make it an end in itself, not just a means to get somewhere else. Be totally present. Notice the sensations, the sounds. Feel your breath.
And how do you know if you're succeeding?
They give a very clear benchmark, the degree of peace you feel inside. That inner peace is the direct measure of how much you're disidentifying from the mind and accessing that deeper dimension.
So for the author, this learning to disidentify from your mind is the most vital step.
Absolutely. The single most vital step on the journey towards enlightenment, they call it. Every time you consciously create one of these gaps, whether through watching the thinker or focusing on the fruit, now the light of your consciousness grows stronger.
I like that sign of progress they mentioned, catching yourself smiling at the voice in your head.
Yeah, isn't that great? Like smiling fondly at a child's antics. It means you're no longer taking the mind's content quite so seriously. Your sense of who you are isn't totally dependent on it anymore.
But let's address the practical concern. Don't we need thinking to survive, to function in the world? The source tackles this head on, right?
They do. They agree. The mind is an instrument. It's a tool. It's meant to be picked up and used for specific tasks, planning your day, solving a practical problem, analyzing information, and then, crucially, when the task is done, you're meant to set it down.
But we don't set it down.
We don't. And the source makes a pretty startling claim that something like 80 to 90% of most people's thinking is not only repetitive and useless, but often actively harmful because it's so negative and dysfunctional. It drains vital energy.
They call it an addiction.
Yes, compulsive thinking is an addiction. And why? Because you no longer feel you have a choice. It feels like it runs you. And even though it causes so much pain, there's this false sense of pleasure, maybe just familiarity, that always turns back into pain eventually.
But why are we addicted? What's the root of it?
According to the source, it's because we're identified with it.
Hmm.
Our entire sense of self, what they call the phantom self or the ego, is derived from the content and activity of our mind.
So we think if the thinking stops, we stop existing.
We genuinely believe that on some level. This ego, this mind-made self, built from conditioning and identification, it needs constant thought to survive. It feeds on thought.
And it has a weird relationship with time.
Totally dysfunctional, they call it. The present moment barely exists for the egoic mind. It's all about the past and the future. It needs the past to maintain its identity. Who am I without my story, my history? And it constantly projects itself into the future, seeking survival or some kind of fulfillment. I'll be happy when, I'll be okay if.
So even when it looks at the present,
It's either seeing it through the distorted lens of past experiences, or it's reducing the present moment to just a means to get to some future goal.
hmm.
It misses the aliveness of the now.
And the key to liberation is the present moment.
That's the paradox. The key is the now, but you can't find the now as long as you are your mind.
What about the fear of losing intelligence? If we quiet the mind, do we become stupid, lose the gift of thought?
Yeah, they address that fear too. They argue that this current stage, where the thinking mind completely dominates consciousness, is just that, a stage in evolution. And frankly, they say, we need to move beyond it urgently, because the mind, when misidentified with, has become like a monster, potentially leading to our own destruction.
And the crucial distinction again, thinking versus consciousness?
They are not synonymous.
Yeah.
Thinking is just one small aspect of consciousness. Thought needs consciousness to exist, but consciousness absolutely does not need thought.
So enlightenment isn't going backwards.
No, it's not falling back to some pre-rational animal level. It's rising above thought into a more inclusive, aware state.
So in this enlightened state, you do still use your mind.
Of course, when you need it for a practical purpose.
Yeah.
But it's used much more effectively, much more focused. That constant, involuntary internal dialogue is gone. There's an underlying stillness.
And for creativity.
They suggest you naturally oscillate. You move between focused thought and that inner stillness, between mind and no mind, which is just consciousness without thought. And they argue it's only through this ability to access stillness that thought becomes truly creative and powerful.
Because the mind on its own isn't creative.
Primarily, they say, it's a survival machine. Attack, defense, gathering information, analyzing threats. That's its default mode. True artists, great scientists, they argue whether they know it or not, tap into that inner stillness, that no mind. The creative impulse arises from there, and then the mind is used as a tool to give it form or work out the details.
They mention that inquiry with mathematicians, including Einstein.
Right. Who reported that actual thinking played only a subordinate role in the breakthrough moments of creativity. The insight came from somewhere else.
So the source writer's takeaway is pretty sharp.
Yeah. Maybe many scientists aren't creative, not because they can't think, but because they can't stop thinking. They're trapped in the tool.
And we just have to look around at nature, at our own bodies.
Absolutely. There's clearly an intelligence at work far vaster than our conceptual mind. The source uses the example of DNA. The instructions in one cell would fill thousands of books. The more we learn, the more we realize how little our thinking mind actually knows.
And when the mind reconnects with that larger intelligence,
Then, the source says, it becomes a truly wonderful instrument, serving something much greater than its own limited purposes.
okay, that covers thinking. But what about emotions? The source acknowledges people often feel even more swept away by emotions. How do they fit into this picture of mind identification?
Well, the source uses mind pretty broadly, remember. It includes thoughts, but also emotions and those unconscious mental emotional patterns. Emotion, in their view, arises right where the mind and body meet.
It's the body's reaction to the mind.
Essentially, yes, a reflection of your mind and the body. So an attack thought creates that energy buildup we call anger, the body getting ready to fight. A threat thought creates that contraction, that energy we feel as fear. Strong emotions literally cause biochemical changes.
And often we're not even aware of the thoughts behind the emotion.
Exactly. The source points out we're often unconscious of the underlying thought patterns. Sometimes it's only by paying attention to the emotion itself, feeling it in the body, that you can start to become aware the thinking that's triggering it.
So more identified you are with your thinking, your judgments, likes, dislikes, the stronger the emotional charge.
Yes, basically the less present you are as the watching consciousness, the more intensely that emotional energy will grip you, whether you realize it fully or not.
And if you're cut off from feeling emotions?
The source warns you'll likely experience them physically instead. as physical problems, tensions, symptoms. They even suggest that strong unconscious emotions can kind of attract external events that mirror them, like someone carrying hidden anger being more prone to being attacked seemingly out of the blue.
So if feeling emotions is hard, they suggest focusing on the body's energy field.
Yeah, tuning into the inner energy field of your body, just feeling the aliveness within. That's a way to get back in touch.
What about when mind and emotions seem to conflict? Thinking no, but feeling yes.
The source addresses that common experience. Their view is quite interesting. If you want to know your true state of mind at that moment, look to the emotion in the body. The body, they say, gives a truthful reflection.
So the thought might be the lie.
And the emotion, the feeling in the body, is the relative truth of what's actually going on unconsciously at that moment.
That conflict between surface thoughts and deeper unconscious processes is common then.
Very common. The unconscious mental activity shows up as emotion in the body, which you can become aware of if you paid attention. So watching the emotion is very similar to watching the thought, but it's felt primarily in the body.
And doing that allows you
To allow the emotion to be there,
to.
to feel it fully without being controlled by it. You're no longer being the anger or being the fear. You are the watcher, the observing presence that is aware of the anger or fear.
Bringing the unconscious into the light.
Exactly. Making the unconscious conscious.
So observing our emotions is just as important as observing thoughts.
Yes, absolutely. The source affirms this strongly. They recommend making it a regular habit. Just check in. Ask yourself, what's going on inside me at this moment? But the key is not to analyze. Don't get lost in stories about why you feel that way. Just watch. Feel the energy directly.
And if there's no strong emotion,
Then go deeper, they suggest. Rest your attention in the inner energy field of the body itself. Feel the subtle aliveness. That, they say, is the doorway into being. Now, an emotion, as the source describes it, is usually an amplified thought pattern, right? It's charged with energy. And because that energy can be so intense, it can easily take you over unless you have enough presence, enough awareness to just watch it.
it wants to take you over.
It really does feel like that. And often, thinking and emotion get locked in this vicious circle. They feed each other. You think about the situation, which fuels the emotion, and the strong emotion then triggers more thoughts about the situation. Round and round it goes.
And the source goes deeper, suggesting all emotions are modifications of one core emotion.
Yeah, this is fascinating. They propose there's one primordial, undifferentiated emotion underneath them all. It stems, they believe, from that fundamental loss of awareness of who you are beyond your name and form, beyond the separate self.
Hard to name, they say, but fear is close.
Fear comes close, yeah. But it also includes this deep sense of abandonment, incompleteness, not being whole,
And they suggest just calling it pain.
simply pain. And a primary task of the mind, as it's usually operating, is to constantly fight or try to remove this underlying emotional pain. That fight is a huge driver of its incessant activity. But all the mind can ever do is cover it up temporarily.
And the struggle makes it worse.
Often, yes. The harder the mind fights the pain, the greater the pain becomes. The mind simply cannot find the solution because, in the source's view, the mind is part of the problem. They use that analogy. The chief of police trying to find the arsonist, but the chief is the arsonist.
So you won't be free of this pain until...
Until you stop identifying with the mind, with the ego. When that identification loosens its grip, the mind's dominance is toppled, and being your true nature can reveal itself.
Okay, but what about positive emotions? Love, joy, peace. Where do they fit in?
Right. The source anticipates that question, and they make a really crucial distinction here.
They aren't emotions in the same category.
No. They describe states like love, joy, and deep peace as being inseparable from your natural interconnection with being. They are aspects of being.
And they can appear as glimpses.
Exactly. Brief glimpses when the mind happens to fall silent, maybe triggered by seeing something beautiful or intense physical exertion or even facing sudden danger. In those moments of stillness, there's this subtle but intense joy, love, or peace.
But the mind usually rushes back in.
Almost immediately, yeah. The noise returns and covers them up. These deeper states, true love, true joy, true peace, they cannot flourish, cannot become your abiding reality until you're free from mind dominance.
And that's why they distinguish them from emotions, because emotion means disturbance.
Precisely. From the Latin moviere, to disturb. Love, joy, and peace, being states of being, are not disturbances. They are profoundly still, yet vibrant.
And they don't have opposites.
Because they arise from beyond the dualistic mind, which operates entirely on opposites. Good, bad, love, hate, etc. Emotions, being part of that mind structure, are always subject to the law of opposites. You feel pleasure, but the potential for pain is always there.
So in the normal mind-identified state, what we often call joy is just.
Often just the short-lived pleasure side of that constant pain-pleasure cycle. And pleasure, the source emphasizes, nearly always comes from something outside you. True joy arises from within.
And what gives pleasure today?
It can easily cause pain tomorrow.
Yeah.
If it changes, if it leaves, its absence becomes suffering.
And what about love in that state?
Similarly, what's often called love can feel good, pleasurable, exciting, but the source describes it as frequently being an addictive clinging, a kind of intense neediness. And because it's rooted in the mind, it can flip into its opposite, hate, resentment, attack incredibly quickly.
Like those relationships that swing wildly.
Exactly. Many love relationships, after the initial euphoria wears off, oscillate constantly between this perceived love and its shadow side.
But real love.
Real love, the source asserts, doesn't cause suffering. How could it? It doesn't suddenly turn into hate. Real joy doesn't become pain. And the encouraging part is, even before you're fully free of the mind, you can experience glimpses of these true states.
They're aspects of our true nature.
Always there. Obscured, maybe, like the sun behind the clouds, as they say, but never destroyed by the mind.
They use that sun clouds analogy explicitly.
Mm-hmm. And they connect all this back to the Buddha's teaching about suffering arising from desire or craving.
How does craving fit in?
From the source's perspective, craving is the mind constantly seeking salvation or fulfillment in external things or in the future. It's looking for substitutes for the joy of being, which is only found within, in the now. As long as you're identified with your mind, you are essentially those cravings, needs, wants, attachments, aversions.
Even the desire for enlightenment can be a trap.
Yes, they warn about that. Even the desire to become free or enlightened can just become another form of craving for future fulfillment, keeping you stuck in the mind's pattern of seeking.
So the solution isn't to try and kill desire.
No, nor is it to try and achieve enlightenment as a future goal. The advice is deceptively simple, yet profound. Become present. Be there as the observer of the mind. Instead of just quoting the Buddha, be the Buddha. Be the awakened one which they insist is accessible now.
And this underlying pain, the source suggests, has gripped humanity for ages.
Yeah, since we collectively lost that deeper awareness of being and became identified primarily with time in the thinking mind, feeling like these meaningless fragments cut off from the source, cut off from each other.
And this emotional pain is inevitable as long as you're identified with mind.
That's the core message. As long as you're spiritually unconscious in that sense. They list all forms of negativity, irritation, anger, resentment, guilt, depression, jealousy as forms of this pain. And every pleasure, every high, contains the seed of its opposite, the seed of pain. It's all part of the same underlying condition rooted in the mind-identified state.
And there are two levels of pain to deal with.
Right. There's the pain you are creating right now through non-acceptance, through judgment, through unconscious reaction. And then there's the pain for the past, the accumulated emotional residue, the pain body as it's sometimes called, that still lives on in your mind and body.
So the task is twofold.
Stop creating new pain in the present and work to dissolve the pain from the past by bringing presence and awareness to it.
Okay, so let's try and wrap up this deep dive into just the first chapter of You Are Not Your Mind. We've really explored this quite radical idea that our constant stream of thinking isn't actually who we are.
Mm-hmm. And that our identification with that mental noise creates a false sense of self and is fundamentally the root cause of so much suffering.
We've looked at how simple yet really powerful practices, like just observing the mind, watching the thinker,
Yeah, or bringing full attention to the present moment, even just feeling the energy in your body.
how these can create crucial space, those gaps of stillness where we can actually begin to touch a deeper reality that joy of being the source talks about.
And we've dug into how our emotions are so deeply tied to our thought patterns. How much of our emotional life might actually stem from a kind of primordial pain rooted in feeling separate.
Right, and how true states like love, joy, and peace exist on a totally different level beyond the fluctuating dualistic world of ordinary emotions.
Yeah, the source really challenges us, doesn't it? To stop looking outside ourselves, stop pinning our hopes on the future for fulfillment.
And instead, to turn inward, to become the observer of our own inner landscape and to cultivate real presence right here in the now.
It leaves us with a pretty profound question to sit with, I think. If, as the author argues, maybe 80 or 90% of our thinking is useless or even harmful,
And if our identification with that thinking is the actual root of our suffering,
then perhaps the most radical, the most transformative action you could ever take isn't about changing the world outside you first.
But maybe just learning how to find that off button for the relentless voice inside your own head?
Yeah. And discovering what incredible treasure might be waiting right there when the thinking finally stops, even for a moment. What stands out most powerfully to you from digging into this?